Hello, hello, hello. Welcome to Be Bold America. I'm your host, Jill Cody. And our program today is Trump's Mind, America's Soul. Today, we have the honor to meet the brave forensic psychiatrist who diagnosed Donald Trump, and as Joshua Kendall wrote in Mother Jones, that Dr. Lee's Cassandra-like warnings turned out to be remarkably prescient. In this interview, Dr. Bandy X Lee will go beyond explaining Donald Trump, but also explain the followers who elevated him and the nation that tolerated him as president. Why does Donald Trump speak and act as he does? Why must he provoke violence? Why do many in the country still support and follow him? How can he possibly be the Republican Party's choice for president again? Dr. Bandy X Lee will tell us the missing piece that answers these questions. With 20 years of experience treating violent offenders and on violence prevention, Dr. Lee was the first to call out Donald Trump's psychological dangers in a major way and lost her faculty position at Yale University by exercising her professional responsibility, her duty to warn. We have big things to do. Dr. Bandy Lee is a medical doctor, a forensic psychiatrist, and a world expert on violence who taught at the Yale School of Medicine and Yale Law School for 17 years before transferring her activities to Columbia and Harvard. She became known to the public by leading a group of mental health professional colleagues in breaking the silence about the immediate past U.S. president's dangerous psychology and publishing the New York Times bestseller, The Dangerous Case of Donald Trump. 37 psychiatrists and mental health experts assess a president. Her newest book, Trump's Mind, America's Soul, Profile of a Nation, explains who are the people who elevated him to the presidency and why did our nation tolerate him. With her specific expertise, Dr. Lee has consulted with over 50 members of the U.S. Congress and is currently president of the World Mental Health Coalition, the largest professional organization to address the problem of dangerous leadership and its contribution to a mental health pandemic. For further information, visit bandylee.com. That's BANDYLEE.com. Welcome to Be Bold America, Dr. Lee.
Hello. Thank you so much for having me.
It is an honor. Thank you for an hour of your valuable time. Now, Dr. Lee, one of the first articles I read about you was in Mother Jones, and in that article, I learned that you weren't paying much attention to the 2016 presidential election at the time due to family reasons, but when you saw the TV footage of Donald Trump at a rally, you were shocked by the way Trump interacted with his crowd. His belligerent behavior meant more to you than it might to a casual viewer. So to begin, tell us what happened after that initial shock of seeing such a man running for president.
Yes, I pretty much recognized what was happening within seconds. It didn't even take minutes because I saw him at a rally and I was observing him interact with his adulating crowd. And it was pretty much the psychology and psychological dynamics I had observed working with violent offenders. I spent most of my career as a forensic psychiatrist, which means working at the interface of psychiatry and the law, which has meant that I've worked in the criminal justice system, evaluated and treated violent offenders, and worked in prison systems where you encounter gangs, street gang members, and people who have done dangerous things. Well, what I was observing at that time was the kind of interaction that I have observed with my patient population, who are mostly seen in jails and prisons. And whereas before I'm from New York City, so I had thought that Donald Trump was an odious personality and a shady businessman, but I did not imagine that he was the kind of violent personality that I recognized him to be when I actually saw him on the screen. So that greatly alarmed me. I didn't think of myself as a political person at that time. I was an academic and a clinician, worked on public health approaches to violence prevention, but I had never really followed any politics or was interested in politics. I would still say that I'm not, but I became very concerned about this kind of personality and dynamic entering into the political arena.
And then what happened when you started gathering the psychiatrists for this conference? Tell us about that.
Yes, so I would say that I did not enter into politics, but the political events invaded my area of expertise in violence prevention, and so I became very concerned. And the morning after the first election, I was inundated with calls because people had known me as a violence expert, and I was working in prison reform at the time. So that was when I had to recognize that if I'd spent my entire career studying, predicting, and preventing violence, would I shy away from participating in perhaps the greatest potential for violence that we've ever faced, meaning even potential loss of human civilization, given the technology he would have access to as president, and military powers he would have access to. So I thought of it as essentially as a public health emergency. So I started talking among my colleagues, and we realized that we had a medical consensus. Pretty much we all recognized that he was dangerous. And it was clear that the public or the media or other politicians weren't quite thinking in these terms, but because we're trained to think about public safety, and in fact, psychiatrists do have an obligation to societal safety and well-being. And so we agreed that we had a duty to society, and that was decided on at a conference that I organized. I realized that knowing the dangers that we faced, we also recognized that the dangers could come to us. Some psychiatrists were afraid that if we spoke up, that we would be sued and harassed, and Trump followers could target us or our families. And others were concerned about how we would appear in terms of psychiatric ethics. But we decided at a conference where I gathered, and I felt that if we collected our voices together, it would have greater strength. So at Yale School of Medicine, I held a conference early in the Trump administration. And I held it also especially because the American Psychiatric Association reinterpreted a very old guideline that everyone pretty much had forgotten about, called the Goldwater Rule. But they reinterpreted it to make it more important than any other ethical guideline, including our primary responsibility to society to protect its health and safety.
Well, what is the Goldwater Rule, just quickly?
Yes. So it, as you can see from the name itself, it was actually politically motivated from the start. After the Goldwater campaign, when Goldwater, there was a kind of a tabloid magazine that did a survey of psychiatrists, and even though less than 10% responded in an irresponsible way, they sensationalized it, saying that more than 1,000 psychiatrists believe Goldwater is unfit. And there are all kinds of graphic diagnoses and things like that, which you couldn't do in in those days, and diagnosis at that time was very introspective, unlike today. So based on that, and based on Republican Party's pressure to the American Medical Association, and then the American Medical Association pressured the American Psychiatric Association to insert this so-called rule, which is not even necessary because you generally don't diagnose anybody you haven't examined. So to single out public figures and say that you shouldn't diagnose public figures without examining them that was the part that singled out public figures to give them more privilege than ordinary people. And so they, with the Trump administration, it was first conceived of in 1964 when Goldwater lost, and the guideline was entered in 1973. It was already considered outdated at that time, and since 1980, we don't even diagnose based on interview alone, especially. In fact, there are many diagnoses we don't even make use of the interview for. So not diagnosing someone without an interview doesn't make any sense anymore. But above all, dangerousness is not a diagnosis. Diagnosis is what you do when you see someone as a patient. A public figure is not a patient. But dangerous or unfitness, actually unfitness based on someone being dangerous, that is something of public interest and is of concern to the public. It's not a diagnosis, and not of concern to a patient. It's of concern to potential victims. So that's how the American Psychiatric Association, in order to silence mental health professionals, and they didn't say that they were the only ones who had the rule, and you had to be a member, which means only 6% of mental health professionals were subject to that rule, but they publicized it, went on public campaigns, I would say a disinformation campaign, in order to protect their own federal funding, and they got richly rewarded for it. Unprecedented windfalls of federal funding came during the Trump administration, and they were able to move their headquarters from Virginia to the center of Washington, D.C., and they're now shoulder to shoulder with Washington lobbyists, whereas before the American Psychiatric Association was pretty obscure.
You coordinated your own conference and had to do it independently.
Yes. And so I did that to protect my medical school because it was good of them to support the conference, and they were at first sponsoring it. But I also didn't. I also realized how politically sensitive this was, and so I told them I'll just make it a conference of my own, and that made the attendance at the conference very low. It was in a 500-person auditorium, and only about 24 people showed up. But then later I realized that hundreds were actually listening in because it was also accessible remotely. And so the interest was much greater than we realized at first. I first thought it was a flop, and then it turned out to be quite a successful conference, and in fact that got us known worldwide when the media found out about it. So out of that conference, we realized that our duty to warn, duty to protect, the regular duties we have as health professionals were far greater and more important than the Goldwater rule, which protects only the public figure. So that's when I decided to edit the book, The Dangerous Case of Donald Trump. At first 27, and then it was the second edition had 37 psychiatrists and mental health experts assessing the president. It was an unprecedented, instant New York Times bestseller of its kind.
Yes.
Yes. So it showed that the public was highly interested. In fact, it was one of the big five publishers, Macmillan, and they were not prepared for the kind of success that it had. It took them 5 weeks to replenish stocks to a level where it wouldn't sell out within an hour. so it was finally able to be sold that meet the demands. And within 3 months, we were the number one topic of national conversation. So at that time, we were quite famous all of a sudden.
All of a sudden, quickly. Well, after the break, I want to get into Trump's mind. You are listening to Be Bold America on KSQD 90.7, 89.5, 89.7 FM. Many voices, one station. Listen globally online from the KSQD.org website. Our topic today is Trump's Mind, America's Soul, and we are speaking with Dr. Bandy X. Lee, who's a medical doctor, a forensic psychiatrist, world expert on violence, and the author of Trump's Mind, America's Soul, Profile of a Nation, and she edited and contributed to The Dangerous Case of Donald Trump anthology. I'm your host, Jill Cody.
Hi, I'm Tom Hartman, your host for Progressive Talk on KSQD 90.7 FM, community radio for the Central Coast, 4 p.m. weekdays. KSQD is a vital media resource for listeners in Santa Cruz and Monterey counties and worldwide on the web. Please help support this station by making a contribution to keep the station thriving. Go to KSQD.org and give what you can to help keep shows like mine coming to you daily at 90.7 FM. You know, with 6 large corporations owning most of the media, it's essential that listeners support grassroots, locally run radio stations like KSQD. Community radio is responsive to its listeners and isn't afraid to challenge the status quo. Please join me, Tom Hartman, in supporting KSQD 90.7 FM, community radio for the Central Coast, by making your pledge today online at KSQD.org. That's 90.7 FM, KSQD. Catch me right here at 4 o'clock this afternoon. Thank you, and tag You're It.
We're back. This live Be Bold America show is edited into a podcast that's available on Apple, Google, Spotify, and many other platforms, including YouTube and on the KSQD website. Please follow our podcast and share it with a friend. That's how this show grows. Now, Dr. Lee, one question I had for you, and we're going into Trump's mind, this very scary place. And one question I had for you is that as an unprofessional, and in my view, I really thought Donald Trump was worse than a malignant narcissist, but that he was a dark triad personality, meaning narcissism, psychopathy, and Machiavellianism in one person. And I know labels may not be that important, but it helps people to understand that, you know, we might have narcissists in our family, we might have a psychopath, but he's head and shoulders above of what we may find in our daily lives. Can you talk about dark triads or embellish on that thought?
Well, for me, he is quite ordinary.
Oh, really? For a violent person?
I treat. Yes.
In your world, yes. Too bad.
The problem was that we gave him power and the kinds of exposure that he would not be able to handle. And so his symptoms ballooned to a level that it became very dangerous. But you're correct in evoking the dark triad personality traits because often narcissism, psychopathy, and Machiavellianism occur together, and that's why the dark triad personality structure has been evoked. I generally make it more a one-dimensional scale in terms of dangerousness. So dangerousness is most correlated with psychopathy. And so in terms of the psychopathy scale, it would be quite concerning. Dangerousness is not necessarily just a diagnosis. It's situational. It's actually really about the situation. So it's the personality, the kinds of tools one has access to carry out the dangerousness, the people who would be the audience and also the victims. So given all those factors, obviously the dangers were high enough for me to feel that I needed to pretty much change my life course entirely to be able to try to warn the public and to educate the public on these dangers. Now, after we achieved this status of number one topic of national conversation and were invited by over 50 members of the U.S. Congress to speak with them, and we felt that they felt that we had the ability to educate the public in a way that would bring board on the medical issues, and they would be able to act politically. At that time, they were very seriously considering the 25th Amendment, and that seemed the most appropriate and viable option. But that was exactly when very surprisingly, the American Psychiatric Association stepped in, intervened, and as I said before, they spread all kinds of disinformation, went on media campaigns, brought on board the New York Times editorial board, and there was Jeffrey Lieberman, a past president of the APA, who just really slandered us.
Wow.
And that was the reason for, apparently they also sent a memo around with the media companies that they became afraid of being sued. So within 2 or 3 weeks even of the New York Times coming out and saying that psychiatrists have no business commenting on the area of their expertise, and this is a newspaper saying so, all the invitations stopped. Or even when they did not stop, in the beginning, I still got a lot of producers inviting me. They would all get canceled at last minute. And I counted up to about 70 news programs and stopped after that.
Oh, dear.
And some were even recorded and not aired. I was interviewed by New York Times reporters at least a dozen times, and none of some articles were centered around my quotes, and only my quotes were taken out.
Of course, of context.
Yes. Some senior reporters were very surprised, but that was my experience. Actually, there was a major newspaper that actually did a whole profile on me, and I told the person that, all my articles were getting canceled and not being published, and he laughed, saying, there's no way this is not going to be published. But yet, all those hours and a professional photographer coming to Yale, and all of that happened, and it was still not published.
Don't tell me. They still, oh my gosh. Well, in
still
the
did not,
book,
but that was,
do it.
I mean, that was actually one of several. That was the most major one.
Wow.
But there were many articles and many programs, and that's the ape action.
Yep.
And look at where we are now.
Yes. And in your book, The Dangerous Case of Donald Trump, Tony Schwartz, who wrote, The Art of the Deal and spent a year with Trump, he said that Trump felt he was compelled to go to war with the world, that it was a binary zero-sum choice for him. You either dominated or you submitted. Tell us more about Trump's mind. What is with that?
That is what happens when you have someone of a psychology that is quite pathological. It's a level I think most people would have difficulty imagining, because it's not within the normal range. Most people are exposed to normal individuals. It would take a mental health professional who's worked with these individuals day in and day out to truly not just understand, but appreciate what this level of compromise means. And we can go into a lot of that, but I'll mainly stick with even though I could give a whole analysis of his personal internal life. In fact, when I was giving grand rounds at Harvard one day on this very topic, the faculty there said, we know more about Trump than any patient we've ever examined, because there's just so much information, and how many people do you get their unfiltered stream of thought 24 hours a day for years, as we did when he was dominating Twitter.
And I think you've said in your book that he's grown more dangerous over time, and that he's a profound danger to Americans and to the rest of the world, but that Trump's impairments are most likely impervious to treatment. Thinking of him being president again is terrifying, because our democracy is already teetering on the brink of authoritarianism, and authoritarianism uses political violence as a tool. In the next minute till our next break, what are your thoughts on that, about the political violence that's happening now?
Well, that's precisely why we felt such an urgency to warn, and there's nothing that we hadn't predicted. In fact, everything has followed exactly the type of dangers and the timing of the dangers, the severity of the dangers were exactly as we had predicted. What has been surprising is the lack of appropriate intervention.
Yes.
And
that's
we
shocking.
go back to the APA's intervention, that we had a chance to intervene in a way that it was called for, and we missed that opportunity. So any other intervention is going to be less effective.
You are listening to Be Bold America on KSQD 90.7, 89.5, 89.7 FM. Many voices, one station. Listen globally online from the KSQD.org website. Our topic today is Trump's Mind, America's Soul. Dr. Bandy Lee is a medical doctor, a forensic psychiatrist, a world expert on violence, and an author of numerous books. Dr. Lee currently is the president of the World Mental Health Coalition, the largest professional organization to address the problem of dangerous leadership. For more information, visit dangerouscase.org or bandylee.com and sign up for her newsletter. We will be right back after Jim Hightower's commentary titled, How Things Work, Congress's Revolving Door.
Hear it? What's that sound? Ooh, it's Washington's revolving door, allowing corporate interests to come directly inside Congress to pervert public policy. That door is now spinning fast because there's a new boss operator in Congress. He's Mike Johnson, who was recently unanimously chosen by Republicans to be their Speaker of the House. He's a corporate wet dream, an affable ultra-conservative from Shreveport who consistently backs the plutocratic agenda of big business over workers, the poor, consumers, and most other Americans. Moreover, Johnson maintains it was God who elevated him to his new position of authority, and that the Bible will guide his policy views. Well, selected parts of the Bible. Don't expect much mercy, justice, and peacemaking from this hardcore laissez-faire ideologue. For example, guess who he's chosen to be his director of policy? Big Pharma's top Washington lobbyist. Dan Ziegler has been the chief influence peddler for a dozen multi-billion-dollar drug giants, including Eli Lilly, Merck, and Pfizer. Ziegler has furiously opposed every legislative effort to stop the rampant price gouging, even though 90% of Americans are clamoring for Congress to clamp down on pharmaceutical ripoffs. But we 90%ers don't control the revolving door. Mike does. Johnson piously cloaks himself in both the Christian gospel and libertarian myth of free markets. Yet he has consistently pushed government action to restrict competition and protect drug monopolies. Now, in his first substantive action as Speaker, he is literally bringing Big Pharma inside to sit with him in the seat of legislative power. This is Jim Hightower saying drug pricing reform will soon come up for a vote in Congress. Before Mike's lobbyist buddy tells him what to do, let's demand that he reread the Sermon on the Mount. The Hightower Radio Lowdown is made possible by you subscribers to Jim Hightower's Lowdown on Substack. Find us at jimhightower.substack.com.
If you're just joining us, our topic today is Trump's Mind, America's Soul. And our bold guest is Dr. Bandy X. Lee, who is a medical doctor and forensic psychiatrist and a world expert on violence, and felt compelled ethically responsible to call out Donald Trump's psychological dangers that subsequently lost her faculty position at Yale University. Dr. Lee is currently president of the World Mental Health Coalition. Find out more at bandylee.com. Now, Dr. Lee, in the commentary, Jim Hightower mentioned the new Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, who believes the earth is 6,000 years old, who says it was God who elevated him, and that the Bible will guide his policies. He immediately reminded me of a Sinclair Lewis quote, who I just recently learned lived in my town of Carmel years ago, obviously. Sinclair Lewis's quote is, "When fascism comes to America, it will be wrapped in the flag and carrying a cross." Now, I find Mike Johnson terrifying as well. Do you have some thoughts of someone like him being second in line to the presidency and what the damage that he could do, cherry-picking the Bible and believing God made him Speaker of the House? I mean, it's appalling to me, and it also seems to me another kind of psychopathy. What are your thoughts?
Well, I have been continually saying that fascism is not a political ideology, but mental pathology in politics.
Ah, interesting.
So, yes. So the characteristic of pathology is that it's, in other words, disease. When there is health, one's ideas are life-affirming, no matter what the ideas are. But when there is disease, it doesn't matter what the ideas are, whether one wraps oneself in a flag and carries a Bible, or does the very opposite. It will end up being destructive because that's the course of pathology. It drives to destruction and death. And so that's a drive that Donald Trump brought to an influential position with lots of exposure to the public over the 4 years that he was in office. And in my book, Profile of a Nation, I argue that his presidency never ended. And for many, it hasn't, because he hasn't been contained. And so this has allowed him to spread his symptoms. And not only that, well, the spread of symptoms, which I call...
Is that what you mean by mental health pandemic?
Yes.
Mm-hmm. Okay.
So we don't think of mental symptoms as being infectious, but in fact, they may be even more infectious than what we ordinarily think of as infectious disease, because you don't need physical exposure for the symptoms to spread. In fact, and symptoms, all psychiatric symptoms are in fact psychosocial. So there's always a social component, and it's not as clearly defined one individual to another. So certain symptoms will spread more readily than others, and those include things like delusions or paranoia or violence proneness. And those were exactly the things that Trump brought to his pulpit. And so there have been many followers. There were people who shared similar symptoms as he to begin with, whom he encouraged. There will be people who are predisposed to having his symptoms, and were activated with his exposure. And there are still others who were normal before and would have taken on his symptoms just because of the prolonged exposure. That's what's meant by a mental health pandemic.
So is this why people still support and follow him, is that they've become mentally unstable because of this pandemic?
Yes, and the thing about shared psychosis is it's shared in that the primary individual, quote unquote, infects the people they have exposure to, but it's not like the secondary people all have the primary illness. So in fact, when you interrupt the exposure, so what happens is that I've worked in, as I've said, in prison settings or in state hospitals, these public sector settings where individuals often go for a long time without treatment, and their symptoms become quite severe. So I've actually seen shared psychosis a lot, where a whole family would take on the symptoms of the primary dominant individual, and the symptoms actually travel via emotional bonds, as well as isolation to a certain degree. So you would see this in families or gangs, and they would even on very bizarre beliefs. But once you hospitalize the primary individual, the others return to normal. It's actually quite a dramatic transformation. So what we have needed with Donald Trump has been to stop the exposure. But of course, his personality symptoms will not allow for that.
And neither will our media. And neither will our media allow for that.
Yes, exactly.
Well,
the media and social media, unfortunately, are programmed to follow pathology because, just like addictions or social media going viral, these pathology would work these much more powerfully. In other words, you would have a much more fervent following at an irrational level than you would by rational persuasion. So yes, someone like the current speaker would not be where he is if there had not been a Donald Trump, or if we had not been exposed to him for such a long period.
Right, and I think there was a recent study too, I don't have it at my fingertips, but they were looking at emotional bonds of people that still support Trump, and they followed him more than their family members. Family and friends were less important than
That's
him.
Right.
You've heard
Yes.
that one too.
Yes, because their family members are probably healthier than Donald Trump.
Well, talking about the media also, because, and we've obviously moved into America's soul, thinking of this country as a patient, our national character seems to be under a trauma response. It just seems to me that our collective trauma is just our basic threads of social life are damaged in the bonds that we have that attaches us together as a community. And I know it's a slow motions type of shock. What's happening to our national character with this trauma?
Well, I had a section in my book called The Battered Nation Syndrome.
Right.
Taken after battered woman syndrome, or battered person syndrome, and that we've been in an abusive relationship with Donald Trump. That was one of the chapters in my original book, The Dangerous Case of Donald Trump. And not only has he emboldened other abusers, he has triggered the trauma symptoms among those who had previously been abused, and he has formed a bond with those who are used to abuse and are bonded to those who abuse them, and he strengthens that that kind of wiring, if you will. In fact, one of the other sections in my book was titled Narcissistic Symbiosis, meaning that those with developmental wounds will form kind of a lock and key relationship with he who has the same developmental wounds, but being hungry for adulation would project grandiose omnipotence to compensate for an inner lack of self-worth, sense of overwhelming inadequacy. But he projects his defenses in reaction to those feelings, a grandiose omnipotence. And then his followers, who are hungry for a parental figure because of their own developmental injury or societal stress, will find him magnetically attractive and irresistible. And that forms the narcissistic symbiosis I describe in the book.
Well, I think it's just stunning that we seem to have so many people with developmental wounds that are attracted to him. It could be 40% of the country. Make me feel better about that.
It's not as high as we believe it is.
Oh, good.
There has certainly been societal stress. So there's developmental injury that makes people stuck in a space where they can't think of self-rule anymore. They can't think of democracy, but they're looking for a parental figure, an authoritarian who will just step in and take care of them and think for them. But it's not just developmental injury that does that, but societal stress. So I think a lot of the nation is just temporarily in that space because these past 7 years have actually been psychologically extremely stressful. It's very stressful to have an unfit, chaotic, and violent person in charge. And
then you overlay that with the climate crisis and the disasters we've been having, the physical.
And he worsened a lot of existential crises while he was in office. He's eliminated critical environmental laws more than any other president. He's made the climate crisis worse in ways no one else did to that degree. He reignited the nuclear arms race. He annulled and failed to renew treaties. He destabilized the geopolitical balance and world order, emboldened violent dictators. He destabilized our democracy. So all these things will be extremely stressful. So these things can happen. The narcissistic wounds can appear because of temporary regression, going back in development, but then will rebound when things get better.
Oh, good. Well, he's basically a destroyer, wants to destroy everything he touches. I am speaking with our bold interview guest, Dr. Bandy X. Lee, and you are listening to Be Bold America on KSQD, 90.7, 89.5, 89.7 FM, many voices, one station. I'm your host, Jill Cody.
Did you know that 6 corporations own 90% of the media in the United States? Isn't it about time we own some too? KSQD 90.7 FM. Your community radio station, your voice, your concerns. Go to www.ksqd.org to get involved and support locally owned grassroots community media. K-Squid, KSQD FM.
Now, Dr. Lee, in these last few minutes, I like to ask what ideas you might have for us to keep doing, stop doing, and start doing regarding coping with this national trauma we've already endured for these past 8 years, and how to cope with the national trauma that's still yet to come. Our future depends on it. I have one more question, though, before we do that, which is, and I'm glad my engineer played that promo, because I wanted to ask about the media. It's an inevitable tool for indoctrination. This country, how can this country survive Fox News? You mentioned in your book, Trump's Mind, America's Soul, regarding the Fox News fear factory. And it's not just Fox News. It's 1,500 right-wing media stations from coast to coast. It's 700 Christian stations, 3 cable networks, all spewing the talking points that are anti-democratic, that are really authoritarianism and pro-psychotic, I think. And there's nothing like it on the progressive, healthy side of the spectrum. So if you can just take a minute on, you think the media and the Fox News or the right-wing fear factory, it's very powerful. What are your thoughts on that?
Yes, I was worried about Fox News since the late 1990s. In fact, I was just finishing residency at the time, but I recognized enough to think that if this is allowed to go on, then there will be a serious public mental health crisis. And then
here we are.
Behold, yes, and Donald Trump was, of course, a beneficiary of that. And because of Fox News' success, so-called success, it has also proliferated with Newsmax and other programs that are moving even further right. And the Fox News model has been also exported around the world.
Oh.
So this kind of disabling of the news media so that a few people could sway public opinion to benefit only them and not the public. So it's a kind of co-opting. And I know you had Densenko on your show at one time. She did a wonderful documentary, The Brainwashing of My Dad, which I thought was extremely prescient and well presented. And we're experiencing the aftermath of that.
And
Absolutely.
Still important to see. It's still applicable to today, even though it was done several years ago. It's an important documentary, yes.
It's remarkable how early it was done, but it covered all the bases. And I also state in my book that the way to heal has three components, removal of the offending agent, in other words, Donald Trump, but probably now several more of his co-conspirators. Also, removal of cultic programming, which is Fox News and that kind of programs that are essentially propaganda and thought reform. And third is fixing the socioeconomic conditions that have led to this level of wounds in society that would make a pathological figure attractive as a leader.
For us, those listening, what can we keep doing, stop doing, and start doing to begin healing the lives, our trauma, living in this country at this time? I know that's a big question, but what are your suggestions?
Well, the thing to keep doing is keep caring about others, caring about oneself. Self-care cannot be undermined, especially at this time. Caring for the self will help one keep one's mental health as well as ethical grounding and asserting our democratic rights, participating in the greatest experiment that the world has seen. Actually, it's a great country. So continuing all those things is essential. The thing to stop doing is stop excusing, enabling, and normalizing what is not normal. I think we all pretty much recognize that Donald Trump is not normal. His approaches are not his unique style of personality, but his authentic personality is usurped by the pathology that's taken over him, as well as what he's spreading. The thing to start doing is ask for access to the appropriate expertise. I know that sounds very specialized, but to meet a mental health problem, we need to hear from mental health experts. And there have been plenty of mental health professionals wishing to speak. wishing to give advice and consult. And it's actually painful to watch before our eyes how things that have obvious solutions, things we could tell what would work and what would not, and yet we have to reinvent the wheel. We have great experts, great scientific knowledge and clinical experience concentrated in this country. Just like the COVID pandemic, we have incredible resources at our disposal. We don't have to shun it and deny it and live as if we were in an era without it. And things like the mental health pandemic that I described, just like any other pandemic, these things are exponential. They only grow worse if you don't intervene. But we do have the public health measures to be able to contain it and improve our collective health.
In this last minute, Dr. Lee, where do you find hope?
Well, I always find hope in human potential, because that's the very reason why I've gone into the field that I've gone into, because the human mind is an incredible resource with almost unlimited potential. And it's quite beautiful to watch a healthy mind unfold with its creativity, its aspirations, and its realizations in everyday life as well as in society. So collectively, there's nothing we cannot do.
Well, Dr. Lee, thank you for being our bold and impressive guest today. I wanted to especially thank you for your bravery. I cannot imagine the nightmare you endured to warn the country about Donald Trump, and it is as important now, if not more, with him being the Republican frontrunner for the next presidential election. I want to acknowledge your continuing courage. Thank you for an hour of your valuable time to be on Be Bold America.
Thank you very much for having me.
It's been an honor. And learn more at dangerouscase.org or visit Dr. Lee's website at bandylee.com. That's BANDYLEE.com. And sign up for her Substack newsletter. What's up next on Be Bold America? Please join us on Sunday, November 19th for Pirates of the Slave Trade. No one present at the Battle of Cape Lopez off the coast of West Africa in 1722 could have known that they were on the edge of history. This obscure yet fierce naval battle would have a monumental impact on British colonies and the future of slavery in America. We will have the honor to be speaking with historian Dr. Angela Sutton, who outlines the complex network of trade routes spanning the Atlantic Ocean, trafficked by agents of empire, private merchants, and brutal pirates alike. Drawing from a wide range of primary historical sources, Dr. Sutton offers a new perspective on how a single battle played a pivotal role in reshaping the trade of enslaved people in ways that affect America to this day. Join me and co-hosting again Dr. Pettis Perry for a new look at roots of slavery in America through swashbuckling naval battles and tales of adventure at sea. Be Bold America, Sunday, November 19th at 5 p.m. As a reminder, Be Bold America is available as a podcast for free on Apple, Google, and Spotify, as well as YouTube and the KSQD website. Please subscribe for free. I want to give a special thank you to Be Bold America's program engineer, Eliza James, and our station's program director, Howard Feldstein. You are listening to KSQD Santa Cruz and KSQT Prunedale. Many voices, one station. Listen worldwide online at ksqd.org. Stay tuned for State of Mind with Deborah Sloss. My name is Jill Cody, and thank you for listening to Be Bold America. Until next time, keep, stop, start.